The unethical treatment of people in medical science. I read Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experiments on Black People from Colonial Times to the Present by Harriet A. Washington. The book discusses the unethical treatment of Black people through the use of slaves by doctors, medical circuses hosting Black people, and Black people's involvement as unknowing participants in experiments. Later in the book, Washington discusses informed consent and how that shapes medical experimentation. What I feel is lacking in this book is the discussion of using data that comes from unethical experiments. I will be delving into different unethical experiments. These experiments include Nazi bone transplants, Nazi freezing experiments, the Tuskegee syphilis study, and lobotomies on mentally ill patients. After introducing you to these experiments, I will answer the question, can the data be used, both in a scientific and ethical aspect? I will also discuss how data from the unethical experiments can be used while still condemning the actions that took place. The Nazi transplant experiments took place in 1942 inside the Ravensbrück women's concentration camp. This set of experiments took place to find treatments for wounded German soldiers during World War II. Patients of this experiment participated in the amputation of their limbs and implanting them into other patients. The removal and implantation of patients' bone and muscle tissues also occurred. Doctors would remove patients' bones, muscles, nerves, and other body parts to monitor their regeneration. Nazi freezing experiments, also called hypothermia experiments, occurred from 1942 to 1943 in the Dachau concentration camp. These experiments involved doctors placing patients in ice water tanks for hours at a time. While patients were in these tanks, doctors monitored the patient's heart rate, body temperature, muscle reflexes, etc. Once patients reached a body temperature of 79.7 degrees Fahrenheit, whether conscious or not, they would be removed from the cold and placed into rewarming, which patients would lay under heat lamps and blankets. The Tuskegee syphilis study took place from 1932 to 1972 at the Tuskegee University in Alabama, USA. Harriet A. Washington discussed this study in her book Medical Apartheid because it exclusively involved 600 Black men. 399 of the 600 men had syphilis, and contrary to popular speculation, the doctors in the Tuskegee syphilis study did not infect any participants with syphilis. The men in the study were promised to be treated for their syphilis. However, they were only treated with placebos. The men were in turn monitored for the progression of the disease within their bodies without their knowledge. This study fostered racial implications, since at the time the study started, it was believed that syphilis was a Black person's disease. Lobotomies on mentally ill patients began around the late 1880s and were discontinued around the mid-1950s. Lobotomies were the surgical procedure of severing the prefrontal lobe within the brain. This procedure derived from the leucotomy. While similar, the leucotomy was the surgical cutting of white nerves in the brain. Lobotomies were used to treat schizophrenia, manic depression, mania, and other mental illnesses. Patients who received a lobotomy experienced reduced tension and aggression, apathetic thoughts, lack of initiative, poor concentration, and an overall reduced emotional response. Now that I have introduced you to the Nazi bone transplants, Nazi freezing experiments, the Tuskegee syphilis study, and lobotomies on mentally ill patients, let's discuss how the data from these experiments could be used in positively advancing science for humanity. While doing this analysis, I will be focusing on 3 key questions. Does the experiment support proper science, and how could this affect the usefulness of the results? What benefit does the data of such experiments serve public health? What adaptations can be made so that the same unethical experiment does not take place again? The use of data from the Nazi transplant experiments. In some aspects, the experiment supports proper science. It does in the sense that doctors were doing something, removing bone and muscle, and monitoring what happens. However, the medical knowledge for this type of research was already founded. A quote from a Czech doctor states, "These operations were performed mostly on insane women, who were immediately killed off after the operation by a quick injection of EpiPen." There would be no benefit of this science since the discoveries were already known. And adapting this experiment would obviously not be killing the patients, which goes into what to avoid. The Nazis wanted to torture people in attempts to kill people not part of the Aryan race. If they were fully focused on proper research, gruesome torture would not have been prevalent. The use of data, the Nazi freezing experiment. This experiment does not support proper science because it's relied on scientifically unsound methods that are carried out in an erratic and fraudulent way. This is stated in a New York Times article. In the same article, Dr. Robert L. Berger states that this experiment cannot advance science or save human lives, so it does not pose benefit to public health. An adaptation for this experiment would be doing small-scale bodily reactions rather than throwing someone in an ice bath for hours at a time. And what to avoid from this experiment is torture. Just like in the last experiment, I stated that the Nazis only wanted to torture and kill off people not a part of the Aryan race. So this is a major flaw in this experiment. The use of data, the Tuskegee syphilis study. In some aspects, this study does support proper science. It monitors the progression of a disease within the human body. However, it does not support proper science with the lack of a proper control group. In Harriet A. Washington's book, Medical Apartheid, she states that a few of the people in the control group contracted syphilis, and they were immediately put into the infected group, which causes improper results. As well, there was lack of proper care to the participants in the study. This study does benefit the public health by showing the progression of an untreated syphilis disease in the Black population. Adaptations for this experiment include a better control group, willing participants, and a diversity in race to show how syphilis, untreated syphilis, will progress in multiple races of people. In this experiment, racism, the lack of informed consent, and lying to participants is what to avoid. The use of data, lobotomies. Lobotomies do not really support proper science. There was a lack of understanding of mental illness within the scientific community during the time lobotomies were popular. As well, doctors used lackadaisical surgical methods when severing the frontal lobe. Lobotomies could benefit public health. Doctors would analyze post-lobotomy patients' altered brain. In turn, lobotomies would help teach how the brain lobes function. A few adaptations of this experiment would include working to have a full understanding of mental illnesses first, making proper surgical methods, and monitoring the effects of somebody post-surgery.